Herzlich willkommen bei ZU, dem Podcast der Zeppelin-Universität. Heute mit einer Aufnahme aus der aktuellen Ringvorlesung.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thanks for having me. I'm going to probably watch Jill, so if you can't hear me, feel free to signal. And also, sorry, this is a decoy mic because this is going to the podcast. So I'm going to feel like I'm speaking loudly enough, but you might not feel that way. So thanks for having me tonight. And thank you especially to Professor Karen Vandenberg for the invitation and also for the very warm introduction. I think this is the first time it's been formally announced that I finished my PhD or have handed it in. So I'm a little bit confused about it still. My name is Sophie Mack Schramm, and I'm going to talk to you about 3 alternative education projects today: AntiUniversity, AntiUniversity Now, and Copenhagen Free University. And I'll be reflecting on how the 3 projects connect to each other, as well as how they connect to formal infrastructures of higher education. And so this is kind of falling within, or it's not kind of, it is falling within the context of this year's arts program theme, academic cannibalism. And this talk is particularly responding within that to the question posed by the arts program about whether, and if so, how, this phantasm of being, I quote, creative, innovative, free, and flexible, end quote, held by academics might function as a form of self-sabotage. More specifically, what I'm curious about here is how mechanisms like historicization bring alternatives back into the fold. So they bring them back into an understanding of conventional or normative models of education. So what I'm thinking about here is how historicization functions as a mechanism or process that can choose to identify or proclaim alternative practices, thank you, as forms of institutions, where am I then? And it can categorize them by defining their place in a discourse or genre. Or it can render them abstract or symbolic rather than concrete or, where am I here? And they're rather than concrete and directly active. I'm sorry, you'll have to bear with me. I've been up for many hours today. So there's a dynamic here that's not exclusive to, but is more palpable in practices of knowledge production and education, so it's more evident in this than in other forms of alternative or oppositional practices. And this dynamic is one where the very proposition of knowing or learning or teaching differently both is understood as an exodus or an exit from existing systems, and thereby any subsequent representation of these practices risks co-opting them back into systems they're opposing. And at the same time, these propositions of knowing or learning or teaching differently become or risk becoming complicit in how they might choose to engage with and change systems from within, and thereby risk sustaining that which they're opposing or seeking to imagine. So there's this kind of constant dynamic between, do you change from within or do you change by leaving, which you might summarize as a kind of like evolution or revolution dynamic or dichotomy. And I don't think that this dynamic is terribly helpful to think through as a finite binary, but rather as an ongoing tension that we can then carefully trace when we're discussing alternative learning projects. Sorry, now I'm having to juggle between. There we go. So this ongoing tension plays out in the context of AntiUniversity as much as in AntiUniversity Now and Copenhagen Free University. And I'll start with AntiUniversity to reflect on the different critical reimaginings and relationships that this project has to the university as an infrastructure. It was founded in 1968 and became an example for the recent wave of alternative education and alternative art education practices that are responding now to the current state of higher education. I'll then discuss 2 contemporary examples, both of which centrally refer to AntiUniversity and thereby begin to position it historically. These contemporary examples are AntiUniversity Now, which was founded in 2015, and Copenhagen Free University, which ran between 2001 and 2007. And the correlations between the 1960s and the 2010s might be something that we can quite simplistically think is clear. These are periods in which students are protesting changing political and institutional structures. In both periods, students are concerned with the instrumentalisation of their education, and education separation from a wider real world in which wars are being waged on their behalves, and their education seems out of time or abstracted from these geopolitical realities. Are these practices, however, a form of infrastructural critique or a form of critical infrastructure for the alternative practices that follow? What importance or difference does it make when we read these practices as deconstructing and reimagining in the present, or as prefiguring and sites of imagination that can be accessed from an as-not-yet future? Now I'm juggling again. So this idea of infrastructural critique comes from Marina Vishmidt, who's a philosopher and art theorist. For Vishmidt, infrastructure is, I quote, a conceptual diagram that enables thought to develop, end quote, by which she means the aspects, qualities, and resources that make certain practices or activities possible. That's what she considers an infrastructure. And what she's responding to here when she initially proposes this idea in a 2017 chapter is institutional critique. And I'm looking around the room and I think many of you will know what institutional critique is or have an idea about it. And so just briefly, it's a form of art practice that critically engaged with the existing conditions of the institution, like the museum, or the institutional form of the art world. And these art practices often took the form of like mimesis, performance, fictionalization, and is understood to kind of have happened between the 60s and the 1960s and the 1990s. And so Vishmidt engages or begins to question institutional critique as follows. So she says, institutional critique is retrospectively identified with a circular or at best enervatingly mimetic relation with the phantom antagonist or enabler or enabling constraint of the institution that is also in you, whereas infrastructure sounds more like reality. Its critique unfolds in a productive register, maybe even as production. And so what's really important here about what Vishmidt is saying is that she's focusing here much more on how art practices and other practices that might use the arts can engage with institutions of art as much as other normalizing institutions, not through considering it a finite form that could be reworked or intervened in or like gently kneaded into change, but rather that the institution is a material and historical construction that therefore can be arranged from that perspective. So we need to move the whole like roots of where the resources come from and how we're accessing those. And for those of you that were in my Philip and Rahel's class last semester, you can think here of like Cameron Rowland. Cameron Rowland is a really good example of like infrastructural critique. And so when Vishmidt considers time, for example, as an infrastructure, she's suggesting that routines and behavioral patterns make certain activities possible and others not. So labor and race are also infrastructures for Vishmidt because they mediate how and with what reach people can access resources. And as is evident from the above quote, as well as how Vishmidt has quickly become a popular reference point for critically engaged art practices and theories, she implicitly emphasizes a need for a more direct relationship to reality. So she's talking here not about a kind of symbolic or abstract idea, but the very literal, material and actual production through which ideas become staged or presented. And so here, if we close read the quote, we can also begin to suggest that the institution is no longer assumed to be only or equally distributed within each of us. So there's no longer a general you for Vishmidt, as institutional critique might propose. But there's also this kind of way in which the institution plays out in or onto each of us differently. So labor, resources, symbols, and access are all unevenly distributed when institutions are approached through the lens of infrastructural critique. And so that's quite a central difference to bear in mind. So whereas institutional critique is really kind of going, here's a general idea of a museum that we're all responding to or that we can all recognize. So you can think of how Andrea Fraser's performances rely on you knowing what codes she's making fun of. With infrastructural critique, things become really specific. Who are you moving through this space and how are you needing to negotiate that? And so that's the theoretical background that I'll be drawing into what I'll now be talking about. because I'm thinking about AntiUniversity and its two contemporary forms of revival in relation to infrastructural critique. Because the form that AntiUniversity initially took is one of questioning the existing university model. And this, of course, includes things like classrooms, student fees, preset disciplinary distinctions. And what's interesting to me with AntiUniversity is how its shifting of relations and resources like time, accessibility, language, and a public interface have since become a possible model, in essence, potentially a new infrastructure or a new refolding back into a kind of convention, in how AntiUniversity Now and Copenhagen Free University use it as a starting point. So it moves from being something that's like perhaps sort of radical or alternative and becomes then used as a kind of historical pretext. And so there's a simple question here of whether AntiUniversity, with that time passing, can still function as an active infrastructural critique, now that it's also become what I might call a critical infrastructure, by which I mean a central precedent that justifies or lends validity to what follows. And in short, in what ways is AntiUniversity acting as infrastructural critique? And how do these other two examples, through participating in the historicization of AntiUniversity, potentially shift or redirect that critique? And if so, what are they shifting it to? How are they using it? And so we'll have a little look at AntiUniversity first. So the kind of what, where, and how of AntiUniversity. So you can see on the far right, that's an image of 49 Rivington Street in London, which is where they were based for at least the first year. It then becomes a bit unclear what happens. So they emerge in the context of widespread student protests, mainly against the Vietnam War, and related concerns around freedom of speech and the role of knowledge in society. And AntiUniversity begins in 1968. It's founded by psychiatrists and psychologists, and I quote, in response to the intellectual bankruptcy and spiritual emptiness of the educational establishment, end quote. And they offer instead courses that seek to connect students to the real world rather than train them for bureaucracy or managerial ends. And so here you can already kind of see how they're positioning themselves. They're acting in response to an establishment, and they're kind of also, in a way, speaking against the places that they were currently working in. Because it's important to note that most of the founding members are actually educators within higher educational institutions. And so they rent this premise on Rivington Street in East London, in what is now a very hip area of London, but at the time would have probably been a bit questionable. And it was initially funded through a loan from what they called the Institute of Phenomenological Studies. This institute, however, is also enigmatic and maybe in itself a form of infrastructural critique or speculation, because it was comprised by the same people who go on to form AntiUniversity, and is described in very few historical records as, I quote, somewhat intangible, end quote. So there's not really clear. They organized one conference, this phenomenological studies group. And this institution, in turn, which was founded in 1966, was established through the behest of the Philadelphia Association, which was a charity that was founded only a year prior to that and focused on alternative practices of psychiatry. So you have this kind of really like strange, one charity is formed, which then forms an institution, which then starts alone, and then we get AntiUniversity. But there's no clear tracing of other things they were funding at the time. And in terms of like psychiatrists and psychologists that you can think of as associated with AntiUniversity, a big one is probably R.D. Laing, who you might remember from he produced this really thin book on knots. I'm not sure if that's not landing, that one. It's quite a good book. It's about kind of questions of social relations. Anyway, so there's an unclear lineage of relations here, which show how AntiUniversity has its roots in what we might simply call alternative science, rather than the arts, in when it starts. And that's interesting to hold on to because of the two examples that subsequently historicize it and where they're coming from. And it's also important to continue to reset AntiUniversity into this wider context of student movements that I was mentioning. So there are big sit-ins and protests at the London School of Economics. There's a UK-wide socialist student movement that calls for changes in university structures, and they send around these really militant telegrams the whole time. And there's campaigns, a lot of campaigns at the time, finally, for Black rights within higher education. And so in this context, AntiUniversity proves very popular. In its first quarter, it garners over 200 registrations for its courses. So it's quite present in the scene. And courses ran per quarter. Enrollment was initially charged at £8 per annum, so £8 a year, to access as many courses as you wanted. The emphasis, as stated in their brochure, was to, I quote, do away with artificial splits and divisions between disciplines and between theory and action. So while stating they were not a university or school, education, or particularly education in an alternative manner to what existed at the time, was central to what they did. They weren't making banners or kind of organizing protests. They were really running courses. And they aligned themselves with similar movements and organizations at the time, including many free universities in the United States, as well as Critical University, which existed across Berlin and Amsterdam, and the New Left School in LA. And some of the founders of AntiUniversity also came directly from the Free University of New York. And so in these alliances and in their very name, they remain rooted in an oppositional but entangled relationship to the university. In short, their very name simultaneously reproclaims the university through figuring it as a phantom to critique or disband from, which kind of continues as a pattern of like how things are named also in the present when you think of the educational turn. And as I was hinting to earlier, there's no clear ending to AntiUniversity. So it begins with this location of Rivington Street, but within the first year, the power dynamic of teacher-student and the organizational committee to the students is called into question by those attending the courses. And they begin to dispute this £8 charge, and they also dispute this organizational hierarchy that they claim is being imposed even. And so what happens is that eventually AntiUniversity stops charging and stops being organized from a central position. And what happens then is they therefore don't have any money to pay the rent for Rivington Street. And so courses then begin to take place in pubs and private houses. And they continue to advertise them, but no longer through catalogues, but through advertising them in the International Times, which is a kind of alternative paper. And that happened every week until autumn 1971. So until this point, we know that it was definitely existing. But in the meantime, the Rivington Street premise is being squatted by some of the AntiUniversity participants. But because we don't have course registration numbers at this point, because no one's paying, we don't really know who was or wasn't in AntiUniversity at this point. And it becomes more of an alternative living project in keeping with protest actions against commercialization and capitalism. So both the Rivington Street commune and the self-run courses are suggestive of AntiUniversity's de-instituting or formalist approach, and then the challenges of how then we can assess this from a historical vantage point. So we could consider AntiUniversity quite genuinely as having never ended. This is what Jakob Jakobsen, who's co-founder of Copenhagen Free University, suggests, because these courses could still be continuing to this day, just not advertised as such. Or you could think of the commune and its practices of co-living once they leave Rivington Street also as continuing to this day. So without a kind of structural form, it becomes very difficult to understand or to claim when an endpoint is. And this leads to a much simpler question of what constitutes the infrastructures or institutional forms here? Like, what do we have to choose to understand AntiUniversity as being? Do we understand it as being the courses? Do we understand it as being the place? Do we understand it as the initial premise against this spiritual emptiness? And from that, then understanding where the constellation of practices can be delimited. And then in terms of maybe thinking really about what was AntiUniversity responding to, so we can talk about them as responding to as a direct critique of what it currently perceives to be insufficient in higher education. So infrastructurally then, it's engaging with and reworking the relational hierarchies of higher education. So everyone's welcome to propose courses. The distinction between teachers and students become more of a labor relationship in the specific context of a classroom. And even with some of the courses it offered, they simply become propositions to convene. So there are a lot of kind of come and study this text together. I haven't read it either mentioned in some of these course descriptions. And it's also changing, importantly, like very practical things like the cost and time commitments of higher education. So now you only need to commit to a term, not even that. You can commit to any combination of courses to be counted as a student. And as a teacher, you no longer get paid in a monetary sense, which we could discuss as problematic, but it's possibly an ethical thinking, right? That knowledge is no longer something that's kind of exchanged for as a service, which becomes something that's very present in contemporary discussions of higher education. And so you get instead an exchange of labor rather than a fee or service paid for. But important to note, however, is like how alternative was AntiUniversity from the position of the present. So it didn't espouse a wholesale collective form of education that completely disbanded teacher and learner. And nor did it renegotiate fundamentally what these positions entailed. It retains a kind of idea that someone teaches a course, everyone else attends. And so in this sense, it seemed to be engaging much more with the question of what are the existing institutional forms at the time, and why or how are they not conducive to learning, and how could that learning become more aligned to ethical or political orientations through essentially taking it out of its kind of heavy historical context of the formal university. And we'll shift focus a bit here and talk about Copenhagen Free University, primarily because it's one of the primary sources of historical account of AntiUniversity comes from Jacob Jacobsen, who's a Danish artist who works on the Anti-History project. And this project included a blog that intended, in its own description, to share these histories and activate them once more. And he also printed the Anti-University of London Anti-History tabloid in 2012. And this collates lots of archival images and articles about AntiUniversity. And a lot of the images, like the colored images, including the one on your right, come from Jacobsen. And he's referencing here to like 60s design. So these kinds of color prints are very common in 60s alternative education pamphlets as well. So it has this feeling of coming from the time, but it's actually a kind of artistic work that he's made, which we might print in the white box later, but we'll speak more about that later. And anyway, Jacobsen is also known for his co-founding of another alternative education practice, Copenhagen Free University, which I'm going to abbreviate to CFU, if that's an easy thing to say. So that runs between 2001 and 2007 from an apartment that Jacobsen and Henriette Heise are living in at the time, and they co-found this together. And they, like AntiUniversity per Jacobsen's historical description of it, aligned with the Situationalists International, and they offer a range of presentations, courses, and talks. And this activity for them was working against or to complicate a wider socio-political context of neoliberalism and the increasingly present knowledge economy, which the duo wanted everyone to withdraw from. And so alongside live events, it produced a lot of publications, and it was interested in knowledge production as a communal and messy practice in opposition to what they identified as the economization of knowledge production, in which they understood the artist to be the key new knowledge worker and the person possibly at most risk of being abused by the system. It was preceded by their founding of Info Center in 1998, which hosted discussions on self-instituting and was happening within their home in London. It closed in 2001, which is presumably when they would have moved to Copenhagen and started CFU. And CFU understood unmediated knowledge exchange as the enabler of social action. So again, you have this kind of direct application of knowledge going on. It closes in 2007 when it felt that they could no longer remain alternative to the mainstream. And in 2010, they receive a letter from the Danish state informing them that just in case they were planning to reopen, that it would be very illegal to. Because, which is a nice, little nudge, no? You'd think they would reopen. But it was infringing on laws about what was to be called a university, which is, of course, something that you have here as well. You can think of Floating University, now called Floating, and then you can't really pronounce the typography there, but it's crossed out. And so in Denmark, the state was now the only one permitted to call something a university. And so CFU is operating, it's important to say here, in the wake of the Bologna Accord, so the kind of widespread standardization of degrees, accreditation, and timescales for higher education. And it's also operating in the wake of the Bologna Accords and the responses in the arts, so specifically the beginning of the educational turn in the art field. And so it becomes very popular as a beginning point within histories of alternative art schools and within the frame of within the educational turn. So you can see that it's mentioned in, that's cut off there, in Art School, which is a edited volume by Stephen Henry Madoff that's kind of questioning what is the future of the art school by looking at past examples of art schools. And it's also cited in Sam Thorne's edited volume School, which offers a recent history of self-organized art education, again from the perspective of practitioners. And it was also exhibited as part of the University of Dundee's Cooper Gallery project, the Ignorant Art School. So the Ignorant Art School includes CFU, and it also includes AntiUniversity. So this is the sort of continued co-option of AntiUniversity into a sort of arts discourse. But interestingly leaves out AntiUniversity Now, which also doesn't show up in either of these two books. So striking then that CFU chooses to close in 2007, shortly prior to the uptick of projects and practices that might have garnered it more presence or more funding or more kind of influence. Their closing was clearly marked and it was really emphasized by them. They publish on on Art Forum, a text in which they really confirm we're really not reopening in 2011. So they're quite keen to kind of say, we received this letter and we refuse. But at the same time, their very founding involves this kind of diffuse idea of what they are. So similar to AntiUniversity, you could, again, if you wanted to, question if or when they ever ended, because they say the following. So, we are not 2 or 3 individuals, we're an institution drifting through various social relations, in the process of being produced and producing. We are people in the house. This position establishes an ever-changing formation, characterized by many contexts, platforms, voices, actions, but also by inability, refusal, evacuation, withdrawal, and exodus. Our subjectivity, what is said and what is done, rises from the material conditions of our everyday lives and subtracts from the mediated rationale of the public sphere. So they're kind of saying the institution will always exist through social relations here, but they're also pointing again to the kind of the ways in which that kind of embodied or self-understanding is related directly to the material structures in which they're existing. And so it becomes interesting to think this alongside their complete "we've ended now." And maybe it's important to say here that Heise has continued to exhibit as a contemporary artist, and Jakobsen less obviously has kind of continued in producing theory. So they seem to have gone their separate ways. And now we move to the last of the kind of triangle of this, which is another alternative education practice that references AntiUniversity. So this is AntiUniversity Now. These snapshots are as hectic as I experienced AntiUniversity Now as being. So I'm sorry I couldn't get you a kind of calmer looking slide here. So it's founded in 2015, purely because 2 of its founders hear about AntiUniversity in a talk by chance and think, this is actually really relevant to what's happening now. So 2015, student fees are continuing on the up, budget cuts continuing to happen across educational institutions, and it's just after a long spate of big student protests, particularly in the UK. And so they find the name and the practice fitting to address the context of the 2010s, and the form of this address becomes the collective organization of workshops and courses over the course of a fortnight on an annual basis. So it normally happens in September. They do 2 weeks of activity. And it describes itself on its Twitter as, I quote, "a collaborative experiment in autonomous radical learning, self-organized education as direct action." So there's a notion here of self-organized education being equated to teaching and learning, as its Instagram rephrases the latter sentence to teaching and learning as direct action. So they're interchangeably thinking about education as the couplet teaching and learning. Direct action here is a form of activist practice in which in which one acts rather than discusses or negotiates the contended issue. So they're also saying education is something that can very materially intervene in existing conditions. And further, and maybe more vitally, direct action is a strategy often used within activism that seeks to elide recuperation into existing norms, often has to function anonymously, and uses tactics and activities that subvert or demand acknowledgements that undermine existing logics of systems or institutions. And you can see that reflected back in how AntiUniversity Now doesn't declare who's in the collective changes. There's no clear kind of singular person running it or responsible for it. And there is also no clear funding stream for it. And so it's this idea of self-organization as education that functions as direct action. And teaching and learning through their equation with education are presented as facets of it that can be mobilized beyond or despite institutional infrastructures. So I'm thinking here of roles, time allocations, fees, and hierarchies, which they begin to tweak and play with through the format of what feels more like a festival than a school system. And this emphasis on education as an act of direct action focuses on the forms through which knowledge production is made possible. And so we can think back here to how CFU was emphasizing practices of knowledge production that are not possible within existing educational institutions, whereas AntiUniversity Now is stressing forms of knowledge production that operate without or against institutions that no longer need them at all. And so the former is functioning as a form of subversion or kind of drawing out the logics of the university or the higher educational structure, which is reinforced through this acknowledgement by the Danish state reminding them that they can't repeat it. And by being recognized as impossible or inadmissible in any future existence, CFU's propositional quality reveals the constraints around knowledge production and what's possible. But AntiUniversity, on the other hand, or AntiUniversity Now, on the other hand, is positioning itself as already outside of or alternative of. It's only centering on direct action. And this is really reflected in the fact that it's not discussed in sort of art discourse or in art history, but involves a lot of people who would be involved in contemporary arts. So there might be a point where it does get discussed. Or maybe ironically, that's also, I write about it in my PhD. So there's a kind of, maybe I've accidentally done that. Sorry, AntiUniversity Now. But importantly here to say in terms of its organizational form, it's structured as an open community in which contributors and participants self-initiate their involvement. So contributors can submit workshops online, and they're accepted without any kind of criteria. So there's no panel, there's no selection procedure, there's purely is there time on the schedule, and is a venue free? And if there's no time or no venue free, if you propose one, you can still perform, or you can still run your workshop. And the organizing committee functions only to create a selection of venues that contributors can choose from. So it manages AntiUniversity Now when it's not in its festival form, and promotes these workshops and courses so they can become visible and held within the loose frame of what they think of as a curriculum. Participation in the workshops is free, and it's up to the contributors to decide the number of participants they're able or willing to accommodate. So many participating in AntiUniversity Now are members of autonomous or activist groups, as well as academics, researchers, and artists, and the venues in which they occur reflect this. So venues for their 2022 edition included art spaces, bars, and community centres. Interestingly, actually, mostly in East London, so quite similar to where AntiUniversity was taking place. And what you can see on this slide is on the top left is a poster for the workshop that I ran. So I ran a workshop within the context with an artist and writer called Dudley. And we ran a workshop called Groupaholics Anonymous, which questioned the format of a group and whether it was necessarily a given or good thing within the realm of self-organized and collective practices. Was a group always the best way to begin direct action? And how could group work be critiqued without hurting people's feelings? And we had 6 participants, of which only one was an art student, and only Dudley and I were explicitly involved in the arts as a primary sector or practice. And during the 2022 iteration, I also attended a workshop about the decolonization of the university, which is the picture on your right, which looks just like a seminar room and felt like a seminar room. It was really like high-level discourse in an area where many Goldsmith students of London lived. There were almost over 30 people there, and there were loads of references to kind of, recent texts around decolonial theory. It did not feel like direct action in my experience of it. So these two experiences, I'm mentioning them to highlight the variance of what is understood here to be self-education, and also perhaps the kind of cultural capital that's beginning to be amassed by people who are actually teachers, for instance. So it's a professor at Goldsmiths giving this lecture on decolonization within the frame of AntiUniversity Now. And this kind of variance in what self-education can be comes both from the lack of structuring or remit demanded from AntiUniversity Now, and the lack of structuring required to participate. So you don't have to choose. You don't have to be chosen, but you also don't have to choose. So you could really have a completely different experience depending on what year you went and what your interests were. And this returns us to the question of infrastructural critique and critical infrastructure, in the sense that AntiUniversity Now is more easily visible as infrastructural critique from a conceptual or collective perspective. So if you don't attend, it's much easier to kind of read it as something that offers free education, freedom of course choice, dissipates education across institutions. But it becomes or could be experienced simply as an infrastructure or a non-divergent only in its costing and formality levels when you're in the position of attendee. So like as soon as I was in these spaces, it did not feel like a kind of conceptual provocation. It felt like many other workshops I've been in the past, including within university contexts. And maybe just to think through this kind of relationship between AntiUniversity Now and AntiUniversity beyond the happenstance, encounter, and inspiration. I think it's interesting here that it simultaneously identifies with a past community, so AntiUniversity of 68 to 71 or 68 to now, and contends for its continued necessity into the present. So the now added onto the term AntiUniversity signals an urgency as much as a return to the histories of AntiUniversity and the need for educational models beyond the university as is. So this bridging across time alongside the condensation of format, so a fortnight is much, much shorter than a quarter of a year, proclaims a repetition that resages the interjection of AntiUniversity. It creates a precedent through its name, which in turn was named in oppositional yet entangled relation. So you get this kind of doubling backwards, and creates a layered positionality through which one might think through what this model is actually now proposing. So AntiUniversity Now undoes the framework of learning over a semester, term, or repeated period, whilst in referencing AntiUniversity, so this is more from the conceptual stance, creates a meta-arc of learning and an affiliation of accomplices and assemblages across time, where alternative or informal institutions can reinforce each other and reopen manners of learning, even if their initial interjection was short or brief in format. And then I'm going to skip ahead a bit to conclude. So, for both AntiUniversity Now and CFU, AntiUniversity functions as a reference or connection point that produces a form of context in which their alterity might be more easily visible. So AntiUniversity Now draws on AntiUniversity's structuring of autonomous learning in terms of their open proposals model. And Jacobson's apartment-based CFU, on the other hand, has its echoes of AntiUniversity both in terms of his writing of the history of it, but also in how CFU aligns living with learning. So its proposition of the use of living space as a site of knowledge production that functions alternatively rather than alongside. That's more akin to this kind of latter dissipation of AntiUniversity. And returning to my opening questions, are these practices a form of infrastructural critique or a form of critical infrastructure for the alternative practices that follow? And my second opening question of what importance or difference does it make when we read these practices as deconstructing and reimagining, or prefiguring and as sites of imagination? So the response, of course, is both, but both in a context of a not so linear or given history. So AntiUniversity Now does not revive AntiUniversity with diligence, but more in relation to its initial impetus or proposition. It's a kind of loose or inspired reference. and CFU, as part of Jacobson's wider interest in educational forms, is important to the 2010s to now historicization of AntiUniversity, and so functions to prefigure in retrospect. And here's where the dynamic of historicization becomes important. Both AntiUniversity Now and CFU address aspects of institutional infrastructures of education, but do so in part through positioning AntiUniversity as their precedent or critical grounding, whilst AntiUniversity concurrently needed the grounding of even more elusive or subjectively formed institutions, like the Institution of Phenomenological Studies. So precedents are not formed in linear time, but they're formed in hindsight, and there you get this kind of layering up. As both the transformation and transposing of resources to AntiUniversity and the writing of AntiUniversity's history by Jacobson from the perspective of the present, and its rewriting through action and naming by AntiUniversity Now, instill or align new precedential relations across time and in multiplying ways. So in short, things are constantly being fixed or unfixed and renegotiated, and it becomes really difficult to understand what are the actual infrastructures that AntiUniversity is fundamentally or was fundamentally saying, if we could ever specify that at all. So to think then or define an alternative educational project or practice or institution requires clearly defining what one is alternating from and how much of that alternation is a shim or a memory or an idea, as much as which elements are material, historically constructed systems that preclude, assume, or direct. And this, in a way, was the central issue, or why I find the term alternative educational institution a bit difficult, because it already assumes like a kind of genre category that doesn't make complete sense. And maybe this is where I'll stop and invite you to think along with Blueprints for Studies, which is the upcoming exhibition in the White Box, because it's precisely one of the underlying questions when we're trying to organize the archive for that, is what do we do with historical alternatives now? Are they still alternative now? How do they relate to current alternatives? And in what ways can we use, abuse, or resource from their infrastructures and understand them as infrastructural critique? So, thank you.
Vielen Dank fürs Zuhören. Das war ZU, der Podcast der Zeppelin-Universität. Zwischen Wirtschaft, Kultur und Politik. Alle Informationen zu unseren Studiengängen und Forschungsgebieten finden Sie im Internet unter zu.de. Wir freuen uns auf Ihren Besuch und sagen bis zum nächsten Mal.